This presentation will be recorded and it will be posted on YouTube afterwards. If you have any questions, please raise your hand feature, but we would like to inform you that the questions will happen at the very far end of the presentation. Today, we have an excellent speaker, Professor Anupam Chander. He's a law professor of Georgetown University, the author of Electronic Silk Road, a Yale University Press, an expert on global regulation of new technologies, graduate of Harvard College and Yale Law School. And I have to say, like, this is a very, very short introduction, and without further ado, I would love him to maybe introduce himself. So, Professor Anupam, go ahead, please. I'll stop my sharing, and please take the screen sharing.
Thank you very much, Ramzi. I'll share my screen in a second. Let me just tee up what I'm going to say first, so you can just focus on my face before I turn it over to
Sure.
PowerPoint. Welcome, everyone. I'm just delighted to have the opportunity to talk with folks in the Netherlands. It's a beautiful, beautiful country, and I enjoy visiting. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, and look forward to someday, returning to international travel for all of us. Apparently, Europeans are now welcome in the United States, so which I'm very pleased about as well. So if you come through DC, feel free to look me up. So I'm a law professor at Georgetown, as Ramzi has just indicated, and I've been writing about issues of data privacy and issues of global internet regulation more generally for the last 20 years. And so I followed, of course, the European developments with great care for over the last 20 years, and certainly, and we've seen huge changes in the United States. This particular paper that I'm about to present was a project commissioned by the World Bank. The World Bank published a study this year, its annual development report, which really is its kind of flagship publication for the World Bank. It sets really the World Bank's agenda for the coming year. Its view as to what is really important, and also how to best kind of focus our attentions, and what is the best research in the area. And so the report is called Data for Better Lives. And the idea is that data has this, really important role in improving our lives. But of course, that data needs to be well governed in order for it to do so. Data has also the possibility of making our lives worse. And so this is part of that larger project. So the World Bank came to me and they said, hey, look, we want to get a sense of how do we compare these different data systems, these regulatory systems. And they identified the three systems that we look at in this paper: the United States, the European Union, and China. And so, you can certainly choose other jurisdictions. You would certainly, I think everyone making these global comparisons would choose the United States and Europe. And then you might quarrel over what are the most important jurisdictions to look at outside those two domains. But I think China is a credible choice in this regard. And so they asked me to look at these questions in those three areas. Now, I did have Chinese speakers in my team, but let me say the China aspect of the study was really not very fruitful. It was very difficult to get information on costs and expenditures, basically costs by the private sector and expenditures also by the public sector with respect to privacy compliance and privacy enforcement, respectively. So the paper is framed really as, what are the costs of privacy compliance with respect to US law? What are the costs of privacy compliance for the private sector with respect to European law and vis-a-vis Chinese law? And what are the costs of enforcement in these three different jurisdictions? We found some answers for jurisdictions 1 and 2, but almost really no answers for jurisdiction 3. And what I want to say is that even the answers that we got in the United States and Europe are really inadequate. And so we did not, we could do some work that was, I think, very helpful on costs of public sector enforcement. In particular, the most reliable aspects of this study, the most robust sources of data come in that area. How much is the government spending to stand up privacy enforcement agencies in various jurisdictions? So that, I think, is the easiest, most robust data that we provide. The harder data is how much are companies that you advise spending to comply with global data regimes, with the US data regime or a European data regime. And there's a fundamental problem here. And what is that fundamental problem? You can't get access to this data because the data is very personal, very private within these companies. Now, why is that so? Why don't the companies publish this data? So here's some conjectures. One, they generally don't publish, general cost data for their operations. They obviously do have, financial reporting and lots of financial reporting obligations, especially with their public companies, et cetera. But the financial reporting is not broken down with respect to costs of data privacy compliance or data security compliance. Those costs aren't typically separated out in any financial accounting rubrics. So the financial accounting systems are not really designed to shed light on those aspects. Now, there's a reason that they haven't, I think, also been revised in this way. One is, what is the right number? What is the number that you should be showing there, right? If you have a low number, that might make you look really good to your investors because you're very efficient, but it might make you look a little non-compliant to enforcers who are like, why are you spending so little on privacy enforcement? And if you spend a lot, you have the opposite worry, which is you might look good to the privacy enforcers, but you might not look so good to your investors. Why are you spending so much when your competitors are spending much less? So this is difficult information to obtain. What the typical approach has been is to do anonymous surveys. We actually did do a survey, an anonymous survey. The survey take-up typically, and I think we're not alone, is very low. And so people do not voluntarily respond and give you great information. And so I don't view these surveys as particularly as rock solid. What the project does is provide you the data that we have, but it's really limited by the nature of the beast, by the limitations of our ability to get robust data. Okay, so with that in mind, I'll proceed. Okay, so let me just find the right slides here. Keep on disappearing. Can you see a slide that says achieving privacy?
Yes, the first PDF document is the
yes,
slide.
Achieving privacy, you see this, okay.
No, but we don't see the slide, we see your downloads folder.
Got it.
Sorry for that.
Okay, sorry, no worries. Okay, now I just have to change the sharing here. Presenting. Microsoft Teams is not as good as Zoom. I am so sorry. So stop presenting and try again. Yeah,
I have to say Microsoft was able to do a good job in getting everyone on board in Teams. That's why we're here.
Yeah. Okay, so it's not showing up here. Let's see. Okay. I'm sorry about this. It's just every time that I
No worries, it happens.
Yeah.
It happens.
Yeah. Trying to get to the right desktop. I'll just share my desktop. That's what I'm going to do, which I really am reluctant to, normally very reluctant to share a desktop, but I think that's what I'm going to have to do here. Okay. Okay, you see my redlined document here.
Yeah,
okay.
now it's looking very well.
Achieving privacy. Okay. So, as I said, this is written for it's the background research for a paper for this big report, the World Bank Group flagship report, as they describe it themselves. Okay. And so first, we'll talk about compliance under the EU regime, then the US regime, then under the Chinese regime. You guys are familiar with different aspects of at least the European regime, I'm sure. And the first focus is on compliance costs for EU data protection law. Here is what the International Association for Privacy Professionals estimates in a 2019 study. And so it looks at salaries, at technologies, third-party technologies, and other, whatever that means. And it basically says that for their members, they're seeing companies spend anything from $250,000 to $2 million on privacy systems, on privacy compliance. And how is that money distributed? Well, it's so the other remarkable thing in this area is that two different studies of the same question will have totally different methodology. There is no unified view as to how to break down the costs of a privacy budget. So a study for a law firm, McDermott, Will, and Emery, breaks it down according to the categories you see at the top of this slide, and the IAPP study performed by Ernst & Young breaks it down with different categories. And so anyway, you can see that managed services personnel are seen as a great part of the budget for McDermott, Will, and Emery's study, and salary and travel make up about half the budget for the IAPP. That is, the privacy professionals and their associated staff are the kind of a great chunk of the ultimate budget. And these budgets range, so depending on, again, whom you ask, what is your budget? Some companies are even saying budgets of greater than 50 million and others of less than $500,000. So this all depends on who is being sampled, who is being polled, who is being asked. FTSE 100 companies here. So according to Statista, which is not an ideal source by any means, and another study by Ponemon Institute, these are, of course, older data, 2018, 2017. You're talking for the FTSE 100 companies, really in the tens of millions of dollars. And by industry, this is broken down by industry sector, more in financial services, as you might have expected, less in industrial goods, as you might have expected. So banks, technology and telecoms spending a ton, and the industrial goods spending less. Though industrial has different definitions in these two, different findings in these two studies. Okay. what are the privacy team responsibilities? What are they doing? What is causing those expenses? Most of them are clearly involved in privacy policies, procedure, and governance. I think that's just by definition. Training, following the law, performing privacy impact assessments, responding to incidents of breach in particular, compliance generally with the GDPR, design of privacy controls, and assuring proper cross-border data transfer is listed according to, is part of the responsibility of at least half of the survey respondents for the IAPP survey. And again, the IAPP survey is focused on their own privacy professionals, the members of the IAPP, as they self-report on this voluntary survey. So outside counsel and consulting is still is about 10% of the expenses. Okay, so most of this is being done in-house, at least at the kinds of firms that are being surveyed here. So I keep on hedging my statements with the limitations of the data that we have. Company spending, again, depending on varies dramatically. So some spending less than 50K, according to this chart, on consulting services and technology, and some spending more than 5 million. Now, significant parts of the exercise of privacy compliance is mapping the data that you have and handling then data access requests by data subjects. The right to know what information you've collected is granted by most of these privacy laws, and it's in the United States. It's not a general right, but it's a right that exists in California for California citizens, and now that right is proliferating through the other statutes that are being passed across the United States. And so handling data subject access requests is also a part of the compliance process. One of the interesting things about this is that it shows that most people do it manually and very few do it through automated means. Though, as you know, third-party service providers are now trying to automate that process, but that means making all the data about people live in certain kinds of formats, etc. Compliance costs for U.S. data protection law. Here again, the data is inadequate, and so again, you should take the next few slides with a grain of salt. Now, these are early projections, very early projections of HIPAA compliance, the Health Insurance and Portability Accountability Act, and in the United States. And so this is one of the early projections, and they're saying basically about a couple $2 billion for the industry per year, or a little bit more, 2 to 5 billion or 2 to 10 billion a year. Now, when there was a modification to a HIPAA privacy rule that basically said you don't have to give as many notices as you're sending out. What they said was the cost of compliance would be lowered by the new rule, and so at that point they estimated what the cost of compliance would be, and so this is really the cost of sending notices to millions and millions of people. okay, or giving them notices when they visit your office. All these costs are projected by the Department of Health and Human Services here. This is a projection from 2013. On the financial side, financial institutions have particular privacy rules. The GBLA, Graham Leach Bliley, GLBA, sorry. And there's just a typo at the top of that. So the GLBA is, here they're saying $2 to $5 billion per year for the entire industry is their general, the idea, and that's merely for the printing costs for all the privacy policy notifications. So that's simply just sending us the privacy notices that I immediately walk over to the trash can. And what are the other costs? Drafting policy, consulting lawyers, hiring IT employees, hiring a chief privacy officer. Those costs, for some reason, were not estimated, which would be, useful to do. And again, an amendment is shown as reducing the costs of sending out notices by something like a few $1 million per year. Okay. Yet another federal privacy statute is the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. The COPPA costs, this was an estimate in 2000, and it feels rather quaint. They estimated costs of $10,000 or in the tens of thousands of dollars. So basically, they were thinking that there'd be one person at a website who might have a part-time position in making sure that you are complying with the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. I think that was an unreasonable assumption at the time. Now, compliance in China, again, I'm going to skip that because our data is so limited in terms of what we know about costs. I should also note that compliance in China is going to become much, much more expensive because China will in November start enforcing its new privacy law, the PIPL, which was just promulgated this summer, and so a very short timetable to come into compliance. The GDPR, the California statute, the CCPA, and the CPRA gave years before enforcement would begin. China is demanding enforcement in months. Now let's turn to the public sector, and here the data are far more readily available, even though the data there even are not perfect, as I'll suggest. Okay, so let's look at the enforcement in the EU. During the course of our study, what counts as the EU itself changes. So we've included the UK appears in most of our studies, and however you want to, whatever you feel about that.
Okay. Until a few months ago, UK was part, so no worries, it's completely understood.
Yeah, exactly. So the UK is listed here, and you'll see Germany here listed twice. And this is because the Länder and the federal government have, somehow are the studies differentiate between their expenditures. That is, there is a lot of state privacy law expenditures in Germany. In fact, the state expenditures are double the federal expenditure. That's not true in the United States, at least thus far, though, of course, with the new proliferation of statutes, of their own statutes, we're going to see this changing in the United States. Okay, so, and I would not have guessed that Italy had the third highest after the UK and Germany. So Germany should be number one in this list in the combination of its state and federal expenditures. Italy comes third. I should have actually quizzed you and about this first if I had planned ahead properly. In terms of showing this chart. The Netherlands, will not surprise you, is among the top 5, right? Which is the reason that you're talking to me, because you guys know that this is a serious issue in the Netherlands. The Dutch authorities are paying attention to these questions. Ireland, the home of some of the largest American tech companies, though that's not exclusively the case. There are, American tech companies based out of Luxembourg and based in Berlin, etc. So some of the big companies are based in these other jurisdictions. I think I heard that eBay, from eBay's privacy council, is based in Berlin or right outside Berlin. And they're regulated by the DPO of that small state for their European operations. And so Ireland spending about 17 million, and Spain spending a little bit less than that. As you may know, Spain has the highest number of enforcement actions. So Spain is taking that $16 million and putting it to good use with a lot of enforcement, with at least a lot of cases, a lot of decisions. And they far outstrip the others in terms of the numbers of decisions. Okay. Here are, we try as much as possible to consolidate a lot of information on a few charts. And so here on the x-axis on the left side, you see, on the y-axis on the left side, number of complaints and data breach received. On the x-axis, the jurisdictions, and on the right side, you see the number of fines imposed. That's that squiggly line. Spain, you see, is the outlier here with a lot of fines imposed. Germany here is the outlier with respect to the number of complaints received. More people complaining in Germany, and secondly in the UK, and third, you guys in the Dutch people have a lot, are willing to file a large number of complaints. Okay. Now, what about number of staff? Okay, so Germany here, 800 or so people employed working in the area, and the UK a little bit less, between 600 and 700. Poland, France, and we'll go down to Ireland here, which is between 100 and say about 150 or so. Now, the number of technology specialists is also broken out, and there Germany has a high number of technology specialists, but the others don't have as many technology specialists that are at work. The y-axis for number of technology specialists has a different scale than the y-axis for the number of FTEs, full-time employees, working in data protection. Okay, now let's turn to the United States. So the budget here is in the tens of millions, so roughly about $60 million. And remarkably, what I'm going to show you is how steady those budget figures are. And that's also true in Europe. You have, even though the digital economy is growing by leaps and bounds, you aren't seeing the budgets of these agencies keeping up. I should say we're likely to see very significant changes under the Biden administration and a Democratic Congress. there is a proposal to make the FTC's budget, to increase this kind of enforcement budget by $1 billion in the United States. So, which would be, more than an order of magnitude increase in the budget that we'll see. And personnel, we're talking about 150 people. This is again in the health care industry, just privacy enforcement in the healthcare industry. As many people in the audience will know, the United States doesn't have a comprehensive omnibus approach to data privacy. It instead says education has these rules, health has these rules, finance has these rules, children have these rules. So it really limits the way that data privacy is enforced in the United States. The FTC spending, it's a paltry amount. Okay, so we're talking about something like 10 or 12 million. Okay, so really a woefully small amount. And we're talking about 50, 60 people working as part of the FTC itself is a larger entity, and this isn't the whole FTC budget. The Federal Trade Commission, which has a broad mandate to regulate against unfair and deceptive practices throughout the economy, not just with respect to privacy and security. But here I'm focusing on the parts of the budget that are allocated specifically for this. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't lawyers at the Department of Justice working in the enforcement side. So this isn't capturing some of the enforcement work and the expenditures going on in other areas of the government. And again, what we can get is expenditures on the cyberspace administration by province in China. And so we're talking about a small amount in a very small city to, a significant amount in a larger province. Now, this is for the cyberspace administration, which also does, this is China, content moderation kind of stuff. And so this is more than just data privacy. So the figures exaggerate how much is spent on data privacy. Again, that is all changing in China because as of November, they have a national law that is very demanding, that is GDPR-like in many ways, that really finds its origins in the GDPR. And so I think, if they choose to enforce it, they will presumably be increasing the budget. We don't get budgets for the Cyberspace Administration of China, the CAC. That I couldn't locate. And the Chinese speakers on my team couldn't locate. So I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but it was not easy to find, and we were unable to do so. And if anyone has any suggestions, I'm very happy to hear your thoughts. Okay, so that is my last slide, and that allows me to kind of I'm just gonna stop here and just say some broader things. So I think it's relatively clear from even that limited data that the expenditures for GDPR compliance are significantly higher than expenditures for compliance with the US data privacy systems. That may change, that I think will change as the California law now becomes much more of a practice. And especially for companies that are national, they have to be able to do data access rights, for example. And that means that data inventorying etc. So all kinds of privacy privacy invasion minimizing practices, or other practices that are a key part of GDPR compliance. American companies that are operating nationally will be forced to do that because of the California law, and now Virginia law, and we're seeing more of that across the country. We can also say, and this is another conclusion in the paper, the expenditures are actually shockingly small. The digital economy is everything. All of us are producing a ton of data. So many companies are gathering this data. This is your dry cleaner. This is your, when you're doing a transaction, a tiny transaction at your little corner shop. All of this is now digitized. We have now, I don't know how popular they are in Europe, but in the pandemic, when we go out to restaurants, the rare occasions that we do, it's QR codes that are being used. So everything I eat, it can be tracked across domains. And I don't know exactly what kind of tracking is going on in those systems, but it's plausible that there is more tracking than I would have expected for just trying to order a sandwich. And so, so I think all of that, the growth of the data economy without it being coupled by a growth in the enforcement budgets is rather shocking. The European Union, which proclaims data protection as a fundamental right, spends less than $1 per person per year on this fundamental right. And so it's hard to imagine that it's really being enforced very vigilantly across either Europe or the United States, or in China. So what I think we do need to have increased budgets for enforcement across the jurisdictions. I'd feel better as an ordinary consumer knowing that there was a sufficient budget for federal watchdogs that are making sure that people are doing what they've promised that they're going to do with my data, or not using it in ways that are really impermissible. So that's what our conclusions are with respect to the World Bank is oriented towards development, as you well know, and so much of our mandate was, what should we advise developing countries? And my general conclusion was, this isn't too expensive to enforce. Now, that said, it is expensive to comply with. And so I think it is useful to think about, what is the best way to design a data protection law. One of the suggestions was potentially considering easier compliance systems for micro and small and perhaps medium-sized enterprises. The risks are not the same, though of course we know that, at least in terms of scale, the risks are by definition lower. But there are risks. I'm not trying to say that there aren't risks, and the GDPR, of course, doesn't have such a small, micro, or medium-sized exception. And I think that will be a controversial suggestion, and I would welcome your thoughts on that as well. All right. I know you guys are all waiting to ask questions. Now, with respect to particular data sources, et cetera, I'm going to point you to the paper. So if you want to know about a particular data source, I will suggest Googling our paper first and foremost, or maybe it can be shared in the chat as well. The paper is called Achieving Privacy. It's available through the World Bank website. I think I've also put it up on SSRN, and so you should be able to find it in multiple websites. Another version of this paper will be published in a law review this coming year, or this fall, maybe. I'm not sure exactly when. It's, I know, it always, they are working very hard on it, and I think it'll come out actually this fall. So I still have time to make corrections and improvements on that version, so I welcome your suggestions. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you so much. That was very interesting walk through the different coasts. We have a question. Actually, we have multiple questions, but let me first maybe highlight your video. One of the questions that just came is like, do you get the impression that some organizations might be taking privacy lightly because of the watchdog's small budgets, hence ineffectiveness?
I suspect that is the case, right? I don't know that. We just don't know. But my suspicion is that, people are hoping to skirt under the radar because the radar is not very discerning, because the radar is not well funded. And so yeah, I think that's very, very likely.
I have few questions of my own, to be honest. So I'm also suggesting anyone else who wants to post the questions until we get like a couple of mine. Well, is it worth checking the Russian privacy laws? Because it seems to me like the focus from the World Bank was on EU versus US versus China as the main, let's say, big players in the digital economy. But in terms of, and this is maybe for cost of compliance, so makes sense, but in terms of also intellectual property being at least claimed that it is stolen somewhere, wouldn't it be beneficial to know the costs you can get, or let's say the penalties you can do in Russia, for example, as a traditionally portrayed, like with some bad actors? I don't want to get into political issues.
Can I just say something about Russia and compliance and IP? So I've written a little bit about Russia and IP and compliance. And so Russia has a kind of compulsory licensing scheme for music. So basically it says that you can copy people's music as long as you pay them a set rate. Now the set rate is so paltry that the American and European music publishers don't take the money because they're so upset. They just think it's piracy, and under Russian law, no, it's paid, but they're just paying pennies on what they should be paying, basically. And so I think there's, Russia is a very, I think, really, I have to say, problematic jurisdiction. And here on the privacy side, I think the data localization stuff is really the kind of clear focus. And you've seen LinkedIn getting in trouble. You've seen now recently, this last week, you saw Google and Apple pulling an app that was designed by the supporters of Alexei Navalny. Why? Because it was designed to help you, as you're voting in your local constituency, figure out who is the opposition candidate that's most likely to win, and therefore help that person, as opposed to splinter your votes among all the various opposition candidates. So the Navalny app is very clever, too clever for the Russian government to tolerate, for Putin to tolerate. And Google and Apple said, we're out. We have people on the ground, and the Russians threatened to arrest Google and Apple workers. And I have to say, at that point, I don't know. I mean, if I were the boss, would I send off my employees to the gulags of Russia? I'm not so sure, to stand for principle. I don't, I know it's a very complicated question, but this is so anyway, so I think Russia is not a good actor in this area. And this last week has demonstrated that vividly yet again.
Yeah, then I would move back to the US. I know that the US, in terms of a lot of laws, are sectorial rather than federal. So when you were talking about the HIP Act, the one for the children, I think it's called COPPA, but I'm always mistaken in the name.
That's right.
I just found it a little bit let's say, intriguing to ask, why is it that after even the Supreme Court, I think that was 1965 or something, said that although the Constitution of the U.S. and the founding, there is two papers, but I'm always like mistaken the names, kind of don't have a clear call out for right of privacy, but we do have like a Supreme Court thing that says there are notions of that, and there should be kind of like a federal role. Why is that not taken? Like this is a question, because I think when you talk about the cost of being compliant, if we're going to have a per state kind of law, which is the current case, it's going to be also for private companies so expensive.
So in the United States, we do, you're right, that we saw with decisions about contraception, the establishment by the Supreme Court that yes, the Constitution recognizes a fundamental right to privacy, but that was a right to privacy against the government. And that's the key difference here. The Europeans conceptualize their right to privacy vis-a-vis private parties and the government, and the Americans conceptualize a fundamental right to privacy against the government. And so, yes, our Constitution doesn't say it explicitly, but as you point out, in the 1960s, the Supreme Court recognized that there was a fundamental right to privacy. The term that's used is the penumbra of the Bill of Rights, the shadow of the Bill of Rights. The shadow it casts includes a right to privacy. The shelter it provides includes a right to privacy, is what the Supreme Court said in the 1960s, and most famously in the Roe v. Wade case. So again, a decision to be able to regulate your private behavior in that way. So that right to privacy, and we have very extensive federal statutes passed in the 70s that regulate what the federal government can do with our data. And so there is extensive regulation of that. Now, the Europeans have complained that those rights don't extend necessarily to Europeans. We did pass a Judicial Redress Act that extended some of the Privacy Act rights to Europeans. That was with the Privacy Shield. So when we get rid of the Privacy Shield, we gave Europeans some rights that Americans had against the U.S. government. But that didn't go far enough, as we saw in Schrems 2. And so that's the source of the thorn in the side of transatlantic relations right now, other than the Australian subs.
I'm happy that you mentioned the Schrems too, because I was going to also like follow up on my question, but maybe generalize it a little bit. So cross-border jurisdictions, I know that this is in even the international law a very complex question, so I won't go fully on that one. But is there any work related to cost or compliance or penalties, that maybe will be part of the future of this paper, or another one about, let's say, the same stuff like now with the Privacy Shield not being adequate? What is the cost from a public perspective? What's the cost from a private perspective? The same goes for, like, again, I know I mentioned Russia just as the fourth biggest e-commerce nation, but like, is there any work that you're going to follow up on for that as well?
Yeah, sure. I'm not doing that work, but I can point you to a couple studies. The first big economic study is by a group called ISACA, based in Brussels. This is Hosokli Makiyama and colleagues. They've done computational general equilibrium models of what if data didn't flow across borders. And so they kind of assume kind of worst case scenario, data localization that is serious, that is enforced. The reality is, here's the reality, data localization is never enforced. It's impossible to enforce it. Okay, whatever Europe does, whatever Max Schrems says, no more, wins every case, the data will still flow. Okay, because it's unless you do what China did with the internet, and you put checkpoints in at every border, you're not going to get that data to stop flowing. right? Because it's just so hard to control that system because data will flow. Now, that said, the biggest companies will comply. So data localization is really about how can I get the big companies, the ones that are most likely to comply, the easiest ones to target, those companies to localize. That's why you see Russia targeting LinkedIn, which is Microsoft. That's why you see Russia targeting Twitter and Google and Apple and things like that. So they are going, and Facebook. Those companies are much more likely to comply with data localization obligations than anyone else because they can be reached. And the others, the smaller minnows, hope to swim in the shadows, hope to get to avoid being. Once in a while, the minnows will be caught, but most of the minnows will get through. And so that's the reality of this. But ISACA, I saw that Facebook had commissioned a study about the cost of data localization that's available on one of the Facebook sites. And so, but all these studies are always self-serving. They are, so we take them all these economic studies I take with a grain of salt. These are studies done for private parties by private parties with a particular goal. I think that should be a given. But they're useful, and they still help us understand. And ISACA's studies, I think, are very useful in this area, and I think there are huge costs to data localization. I've written a paper. I have a paper called Data Nationalism that is a thorough critique of the arguments for data localization, saying if you're thinking that this helps security, if you think that it helps privacy, if you're thinking that it helps economic development, I think you're wrong in all these things. One area that it might help on is law enforcement access to data. But what you're really doing is you're trading foreign surveillance for domestic surveillance. That's really the ultimate goal, and that's Russia's goal with respect to data localization.
I think that's multiple states depending on where you ask. We have a question that just came in. Like, is there expected growth of budget from the Biden administration in the U.S. in relation to the Privacy Shield repair?
So we're going to see very strong statements coming out of the Biden administration, out of the Commerce Department, saying we are serious. Now, let me say, from what I've so. In the context of writing this paper, we talked to a lot of leading lawyers across Europe, the United States, and China, and elsewhere, in Africa and in Brazil. And so everyone said the Privacy Shield was working. That is, if you were one of the 2,000 or so, I've forgotten the exact number of companies that had adhered to the Privacy Shield, the lawyers said they took this seriously. They were committed to complying, and I think the FTC took it seriously too. Why are you committed to complying? Because you're afraid about the FTC. If the FTC turns its eye on you, you are not happy. And so that is not a good situation to be in. And so I think they had volunteered for this extra scrutiny, and it seems that they took it very seriously. So I do think that we will see with Privacy Shield 2, which I hope is around the corner, but one never knows. Yep. One never knows. I hear, maybe October, we might get something. I don't know. But maybe all those will be for not. But I think that with any Privacy Shield will be, again, more resources, more vigorous statements in this regard.
Yeah, one last question before we close. Is there any, let's say, I know that you mentioned the conclusions didn't contain let's say, a lot of certainties in regards to, for example, China, but is there any aspect where you have a recommendation with the optimum spending from a public perspective, at least, and or maybe a number per, like you used a very good example in the presentation about like the EU versus the population, and you said like less than 0. I think, if I'm not quoting you wrongly,
Yeah,
0.01.
less than $1 a day.
Yeah.
So I have to say this Biden administration proposals to increase the FTC's enforcement budget by $1 billion. That sounded about right. I kind of like that. That was a nice figure for me. I got it, and I think that's the orders of magnitude that we need to see. And it's an enormous job. I think European Union. I think myself, as you see, I prefer micro, small exemption, and it also, are you really going to be chasing after, individual dry cleaners and restaurants and things like that? It makes no sense whatsoever from a compliance perspective, from a risk and protection of your citizenry perspective. So if you aren't, why have these obligations in the first place? I mean, if you're never going to enforce those, is that really law? So what do we make of that? If I'm someone advising, do I say, hey, yeah, let's make sure to register with the DPO because you've got a client list of people, how they like their shirts starched? Really, just, does that make sense? I'm really happy. So feel free to contact me about those kinds of questions. I'd love to have your stories about this. And so I should give you my email address. It's a complicated email, but it's ac1931 @georgetown.edu. That's AC, as in cat, 1931. There's nothing particular. I don't know why 1931. I wasn't born in 1931.
I was going to ask, actually.
I have no idea. Just randomly assigned. Maybe at the 19th, I'm the 1931st person to have an AC, first two initials. That's probably the most likely scenario. And I'd love to hear from you.
Yep. I think we had a one-man find here in the Netherlands. Gilbert was just posing, but yeah, we do have a public enforcement website. I don't have it up on top of my head, but maybe we can send it to everyone later on. That shows like each and every one. And there are some places where someone put a camera in front of his door and he was fined for like 12,000 euros because of the breach of GDPR. I would love to thank you so much for today's presentation. It was very, very, very enjoyable and very eye-opening on the different aspects, especially on the enforcement side. So thank you so much for the great talk, and hope we host you again in another presentation.
Take care.
For now, I would like to thank everyone for attending the ISACA Square Tables. Next week, on September 29th, we have Sergey Pinchuk. He's the CTO from CompuSec. The title is not yet announced, but it will be announced during the week. Thank you so much, and have a great, great evening, and see you later then. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot, Bob.